Welcome. We are a body like Bruce, and we don't think we have brought this book via a video upload. This is titled Bruce Lee, the Man Only I Knew, by his ex-wife, Linda Lee, or his widow. His true story, how the deadliest exponent of unarmed combat lived, loved, fought and died. The Way of the Fighter, Bruce Lee's true story. His goal? To be the first Oriental superstar, to raise his people to a place of honour in the world, to give his family a good life, and most of all to be respected as a man. His genius? He was the deadliest kung fu fighter, improving the ancient art into Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. He did away with the classic stances, developing a technique of moving with the action, adapting to each situation. Follow his rise to fame and fortune, learn the philosophy and the methods he developed, and share his deepest feelings as Linda, his wife and closest friend, remembers his life and tragic death in Bruce Lee, the Man Only I Knew. And she dedicated it to her children, the two people who brought to Bruce more joy, more love and more fulfillment than all the wings of fame and fortune. Linda states here that she hoped they know he loved them as life itself. Well, we believe that they do. Shannon is the survivor, his last remaining child. This book is dedicated to Brandon and Shannon, that they may know the rich legacy which is theirs alone. Linda Lee. Chapter 1. It was around noon on July 20, 1973, when I, Linda, left our Kowloon house to lunch with a girlfriend. Bruce was in his study at the time, dictating to his secretary. His study, of course, was the most important room in the house. It was where he kept all his books. He had a magnificent library of several thousand volumes dealing with every conceivable aspect of physical combat, ancient and modern, as well as with weapons of all kinds, calisthenics, sports, filmmaking, and both Oriental and Western philosophy. He even had a book on Islam. Though the focal point was probably the big desk with its telephones, Bruce practically lived in his study. He would lock himself away for hours to read and study. He conducted most of his business from his desk, worked on script of The Way of the Dragon and Into the Dragon, his classic presentations of the martial art of Kung Fu. He was his usual industrious, intense self when Linda left him. Through the veranda window he could see their garden, which had been laid out in the Japanese style, with wandering paths and a goldfish pond with a little bridge across it, and a stream which meandered in and out of the trees and through the Korean grass. By Hong Kong standards, they had a lavish place, an 11-room villa with spacious grounds surrounded by an 8-foot high stone wall and a large wrought iron gate at the front entrance. They had not consciously set out to live in such style, but Hong Kong was cramped and overcrowded. Most people lived in small flats, stacked one on top of the other, and there were only a few residential properties available, all rather large and expensive. Bruce, however, desperately needed to escape the noises of everyday living and the shouts of children to work and study, so they were fortunate to find a residential property for sale. Bruce told Linda that producer Raymond Chow of Golden Harvest was coming over that afternoon to talk about script ideas for The Game of Death. Most of the action scenes for this film had been shot, including a spectacular encounter between Bruce, who was only 5'7", and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the American basketball star, who was 7'2". As yet, though they had neither a finished plot nor script at that time, the film was still uncompleted. Bruce said that he and Chow would probably dine later with George Lazenby, that's the Australian actor who played James Bond for a very short time, whom Raymond hoped to co-star. Lazenby is the actor who took over the James Bond role when Sean Connery quit. That was the last conversation Linda ever had with her husband. Bruce. She returned home about 4 o'clock and spent the evening doing her physical exercises and watching TV in Bruce's study with the two children, Brandon and Shannon. Linda remembered thinking it a little odd that Bruce hadn't phoned, for although he had told her he would probably be dining out, he usually called to confirm arrangements. Instead, sometime around 10 o'clock, Raymond Chow called. There was a note of urgency in his voice. "Would you go to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital right away, Linda?" he said. "Bruce is on the way there, in an ambulance." "What's the matter?" she demanded. "I don't know, something like the last time." She was terribly concerned, but she couldn't say that she was shocked because Bruce was always involved in the unexpected. Besides, they had been through many crises before. Linda had learned to flow with him in the current of his chosen lifestyle, to live each moment for itself. He was constantly phoning and saying, "Meet me in 15 minutes," or "Listen, Linda, I've just had the most fantastic news." Even before we were married, they were married. Linda told him, or he told Linda. No, Linda told him, "You know, Bruce, I just can't keep up with you." Only 3 months earlier, on May 10th, he had collapsed at the studios and been rushed to the hospital, but had quickly recovered. Later, medical tests in Los Angeles had disclosed nothing wrong with him. The doctors indeed had assured him that he was as fit as an 18-year-old. Linda arrived at the hospital about 15 minutes before the ambulance, but at first it seemed as if there had been some mistake because nobody knew anything about Bruce being brought in, and the man at the desk even suggested somebody must have been joking. "We don't know anything about it." Linda hung on, however, and eventually the ambulance arrived. He was apparently unconscious, but Linda could not find out exactly what was happening because the doctors were swarming around him. He was carried into an emergency ward and a team began massaging his heart. It never occurred to Linda that he might die, might even be dead, probably because she thought that once he had arrived in the hospital, everything was going to be alright. Bruce had talked about death more than once in recent months. He was certainly convinced that he would never live to be an old man, nor indeed did he want to. He told his brother Robert that he hated the idea of growing old and weak. "I won't live as long as you," he told Linda one day. "Why would you think that?" she asked. "You're a lot healthier than she was, and in far better condition, for heaven's sake." "I don't really know. The fact is I don't know how long I can keep this up." Bruce, in so many senses, the very essence of physical fitness, a man almost totally absorbed with his body and extraordinary abilities, subconsciously felt as have other men who die young. A strong sense of urgency to get a great many things done in a short space of time. He was under the severest pressures. A unique artist and a legend in his own lifetime, karate experts everywhere recognized him as the Galileo of the martial arts, the deadliest fighting exponent of unarmed combat in the world. He was well on the way to becoming the highest paid actor in films. He was the first Oriental superstar to bridge the chasm between East and West, to contradict the outrageous stereotypes represented on film and TV by such Chinese figures as Charlie Chan and Dr. Fu Manchu. Because Christopher Lee played that part, and there was that silly one with Mickey Rooney. You see it on the Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. He didn't like that sort of thing. Because Charlie Chan, Dr. Fu Manchu on TV as Chinese figures, had therefore become a hero to millions in Southeast Asia who identified with him, Bruce Lee, and saw him as a champion. A lethal whirlwind of flying fists and blurring legs, his magic kick had taken Western audiences by storm as he spectacularly revealed mysteries known only to the Chinese for centuries. Single-handedly he had made the whole world conscious of Kung Fu. Suddenly Bruce found himself in urgent demand by filmmakers everywhere. Phil Oakes, a member of the legendary New York folk music circle of the early 60s that once included Bob Dylan, had described how he sat entranced for 3 hours when he first stumbled across two of Bruce's films in the Philippines. "I could hardly believe my eyes. I had seen the Japanese samurai movies, probably the Kurosawa ones, but was not prepared for what was to come. The stories were simplistic and based mainly on revenge. They always involved fighting schools and a revered master teacher." Isn't that how all those kung fu movies from way back were? "I will teach you to be the best fighters in the world, but you must never use it to harm anyone unless absolutely necessary. Near the beginning is the act of outrage, the insults of a rival school, the poisoning of a master, the murder of a loved one. Lee, the hero, the best fighter, demands vengeance and is always restrained until he can hold himself in no longer. Then follows the most exciting action ever filmed. for the screen. One man against 50 with no weapons. He begins to wade his way through the lesser villains with karate chops, his fists, his elbows, his feet. There are no camera tricks. The audience is hysterical, clapping, cheering, sometimes leaping to their feet. When he gets to the major villains, it becomes a dance of extraordinary beauty. One reviewer said that Lee made Rudolph Nureyev look like a truck driver. It is not the vulgarity of James Arness pistol whipping a stubbled, drunken stage robber. It is not the ingenious devices of James Bond coming to the rescue, nor the ham-fisted John Wayne slinging it out in his saloon over crumbling tables and paper-thin imitation glass. It is the science of the body taken to its highest form, and the violence, no matter how outrageous, is always strangely purifying. As important as the action is the face and mind of Bruce Lee, the expressions on his face as he psychs out his opponents are beyond description. At times he is lost in ecstasy, almost sexual, and when he strikes, the force of his blow is continued by his mind, and the look of concentration and satisfaction is devastating. The offers poured in. Run Shaw, the Hong Kong millionaire film producer who only 3 years earlier had offered him a ridiculously small amount for a film, now offered him £100,000 a film, and when Bruce brushed it aside, sent him a signed open contract with a request that he fill in his own figures. Sophia Loren's producer husband, Carlo Ponti, was only one of several Italian filmmakers who cabled him fantastic offers. Warner Brothers had already spent close to $1 million making Enter the Dragon, that is still to be released at that time, and urgently intended to follow it up. As the craze for kung fu movies swept the world, Bruce found himself the hottest property in show business, a greater box office star than Steve McQueen. Did not he not say in his biographies, etc., he would be bigger than Steve McQueen? Simultaneously, his problems multiplied. Could he widen his international appeal without destroying his popularity on the Mandarin circuit? Could he inject greater quality into his films without destroying the essence? Perhaps help to educate the millions with whom he shared ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Teach martial artists everywhere the need to find their own truth. He was beset too by sheer physical day-to-day problems. Working and living conditions in Hong Kong are scarcely ideal. Hong Kong can be a pretty rough place. There were always people challenging him to fight on the streets, hoping to boast that they had beaten the master. He could never escape from business associates, from people wanting to make deals or thrusting contracts literally under his nose, from the press, radio, TV, from autograph hunters mobbing him whenever he appeared. In Hollywood, it would have been easy to get out of town on weekends or relax for a day or two in the country, but in cramped Hong Kong it was out of the question. By nature and temperament, too, Bruce had a craving for high-wire living. He was a highly strung person and under certain conditions could even become quite excitable. When he was a child, his family had nicknamed him in Chinese, "Never sit still." He knew he needed to relax, but somehow there was always something that had to be attended to immediately. There never was time. Throughout early 1973, Bruce was constantly on the go, arguing over scripts or talking for hours on the telephone or holding conferences. Towards the end, he had so many problems in his head that he could not sleep. The strains had dramatically intensified once he decided to make Enter the Dragon his first big international picture. He was nervous and apprehensive about tackling it. There were major problems with the script and complications arising from the differences between Hollywood and Hong Kong movie production values. It was a time too when he was suffering many emotional ups and downs. Bruce was always a very emotionally involved person, one of the reasons for his success, but the pressures at the time made him especially moody. Linda had tried to tell him that there was no longer any need for him to work so hard, that his career was now running along the right lines, and the future was assured. Besides, the important thing was that the four of them, it'd be Linda, Brandon, Shannon and Bruce, should be together, that as long as they had each other, everything was fine. Yet it was not easy for Bruce to forget the relatively lean times they had earlier experienced, and he was determined that the children and Linda should never again have to face anything like financial uncertainty. There was a point where he wasn't making any money, couldn't get any roles, or they just suddenly dropped him, and so forth, so yeah, it made it very hard on him. Once or twice he talked about in case anything happens to him, for he was aware that everything depended on a fragile foundation. His continued physical fitness. In 1970 he had suffered a terrific shock. Few men, Linda supposes, was supposed. Had he ever sought to discipline their bodies with such dedication as Bruce, there was hardly an inch of his lithe, beautifully balanced frame with its steel-like muscles which he had not subjected to fierce and repeated exercises. Weightlifting was normally not too important to him. He merely used weights for a few specific areas of his body to develop power rather than large muscles. But one morning he decided to experiment with a 125-pound weight, placing the weight on his shoulders and bending over from the waist while keeping his back straight. Linda didn't think he fully appreciated how strenuous this exercise was, for he suddenly felt a terrible pain in the lower part of his back. The doctor told him he had damaged a sacral nerve and would never do his kung fu kick again. But short of having both his legs chopped off, Bruce could never reconcile himself to giving up kung fu. The doctor warned him it meant lying on his back for a long time. Normally telling Bruce even to take it easy was like trying to tell a grasshopper not to jump, but when he set his mind to it, he could do anything. He stayed in bed for 3 months, enduring a period of great mental and physical pain, stress and financial problems. Altogether it was more than 6 months before he could resume even light training, but even during his recuperation his mind remained extraordinarily active. So he couldn't train physically, so he trained himself mentally. He imagined that he was doing all of this, and then he came up with different ideas, concepts for his philosophy, etc., etc. Those months were spent setting down notes on the martial way. Linda at that time was presently compiling these and would work them into a separate book to be published at a later date. Probably the Tao Chi Kung, etc. It was possibly the blackest period in his life, the only time Linda thinks, when his soaring spirit felt the full weight of the world, but the lessons were not lost on him, and if he ever felt inclined to forget them, a twinge of pain reminded him. Nevertheless, he still continued to live life with his usual zest and energy, and yet Linda sensed that the tensions and pressures were reaching their peak. Had he lived, she's pretty sure he would have found an inner contentment. He would have found an inner contentment based on his philosophy of life. And Linda believed he sensed it himself, not simply that he would die, but that a major turning point was imminent. He loved the song "And When I Die," and the lines which go, "If it's peace you find dying, well then let the time be near." Once or twice he mentioned, maybe that's the only place where I'll find peace. John Saxon, who starred with him in Enter the Dragon, says that Bruce was really shaken by his collapse in May, and while awaiting the outcome of the Los Angeles test, said to him, maybe if they don't work out, there isn't going to be a Bruce Lee. And so now, for the second time within 3 months, Linda found herself in a bare hospital ward, watching a team of doctors working on him. Strangely, she felt almost no emotion. She supposes she was too numbed by shock, and that's the reason why. Grief, despair, the sense of loss, all these were to come later. Besides, Linda believed Bruce was merely unconscious, for nobody had told her he was already dead. After a minute or so, they suddenly rushed Bruce upstairs, and they all had to run along the corridor to an intense care unit. Here they injected drugs directly into Bruce's heart and applied electric shock treatment. Somebody tried to pull her away, saying, "I don't think you want to see this, Linda," but she struggled free and insisted, "Leave me alone, I want to know what's happening." Then she noticed that the machine recording Bruce's heartbeat had stopped. It must have flatlined. It stopped beeping, which indicated that he was not alive, and she suddenly realised what had really happened. Yet she still refused to believe the unbelievable. She was convinced that Bruce would always win through. He had so much life and vitality, he generated so much inner force and had such control over his mind and his body. He had fought his way out of so many adverse situations and survived so much. She simply could not accept that he would not win through as he had in May. When she asked the doctor, she did not use the word dead. It was not a word she could use about Bruce. Instead, she asked, "Is he alive?" The doctor shook his head. She can't remember much about what happened after that. She knows she wandered along the corridor by herself for a while. Then she vaguely remembered Raymond Chow telephoning his wife, asking her to come and pick her up, and the children. She remembers the head of the medical team asking her if she wanted an autopsy and replying, "Yes, I want to know how he died." Linda remembered the reporters swarming in the hospital entrance and the flash of photographers, bulbs. She insisted on going back to see Bruce one more time to make sure for herself that he was gone. And as she then reflected, it was at that point, when the life force had barely been extinguished, that she felt an incredible strength surge through her body and spirit. No panic or despair. The determination and courage of Bruce himself passed to her. In a flash she knew what lay ahead and how she should deal with everything in the best possible way for Bruce, Brandon and Shannon. It was only much later that Linda became conscious that, because he was an almost mythical figure, Bruce's death would stun millions all over the world. Yet even Linda could hardly have guessed that more than 1 year after his death, his name would, if anything, be even greater and more widely known than when he was alive, that his films would be revived again and again, that like earlier great screen figures such as Rudolph Valentino and James Dean, who had died before their time, he would become the nexus of a world cult. 2. Linda states here she first saw Bruce Lee in the spring of 1963 while she was attending Garfield High School in Seattle. Bruce, who was then a philosophy major at the University of Washington, used to come to her school to lecture in Oriental philosophy, and you often saw him walking around the halls, always with a girlfriend. And she was told that since he was 15, Bruce had never had any trouble dating girls. Linda spoke to him for the first time when a Chinese girlfriend of hers, who was taking lessons in the martial arts, brought her along one evening to Bruce's little basement club in Seattle's Chinatown, a dingy little cell no more than 20 feet by 20 feet. He called this the Chun Fan Kung Fu Institute because his Chinese name was Lee Chun Fan, and because he pronounced Kung Fu in the Cantonese style, Kung Fu. He had begun by giving lessons in parking lots, empty buildings, school gyms or fraternity houses. Then, realizing the potential for martial arts in America, karate was just beginning to catch on. He had decided to open the club. He planned to open a chain of kung fu schools throughout the United States. This idea he eventually found impractical because neither his methods nor the philosophy that lay behind them could be taught en masse. He just couldn't understand why people just couldn't grasp what he's trying to teach them. Why couldn't they do what he did? He made no attempt to advertise the institute, and there wasn't even a sign outside the door. He hoped that the school's reputation and the value of its instruction would be spread by word of mouth. He wanted to teach people who, apart from a genuine interest in the martial arts, were prepared to grapple with the philosophical ideas underlying them. Linda supposed that the first thing she noticed about Bruce was the immense command he had of his body, the amazing reflexes that seemed more feline than human, the ability to perform quite astonishing feats of strength, such as doing press-ups or push-ups on one finger. Nothing, of course, had prepared her for the sheer impact of his personality. And it carries on from there. Bruce, Linda knew, had been accused of needing to be at the centre of a cult, yet he could no more help being at the centre of a cult, or indeed anything else, than a tornado can stop twisting. He was certainly a total extrovert who loved performing, but it was all done with an almost childlike innocence, a cheerful frankness. In addition, his deep knowledge of philosophy and psychology, his wide range of reading, his wit and verbal dexterity, his easy poised charm, his physical grace and skill, and the sheer intensity of a personality made him a natural leader. Hollywood producer Fred Weintraub insists that watching Bruce at Kung Fu was on a par with seeing Jaginski dance or hearing Beethoven play the piano. When Linda first met Bruce, she did think him a bit cocky, but she soon realised that was what she was seeing was self-confidence and self-assurance, not a form of boastfulness. If Bruce said he could do something or claimed he knew something, she found he was always speaking the truth. A picture of Bruce Lee, a young man in love, his dreams of glory still only dreams. and talks about Bruce giving demonstrations to Bob Baker and James Coburn and punching a solid 70-pound bag and sending them flying, or a pad and sending them flying across the room. James Coburn fell on his chair and broke it. He's like, "Oh damn, you broke my chair." Some stories like that. He goes into his birth, his life as a child, etc. Bruce demonstrating his famous 1-inch punch. And talks about how he felt about America. Bruce demonstrating one of the kicks he made famous the world over. Bruce Lee's fighting style was all his own. In the following years, as fate was to whirl him into unique and demanding environments, Bruce's thinking necessarily became more flexible. He was able to adapt and fit into his changing lifestyle. "The world," wrote Bruce, "is full of people who are determined to be somebody or give trouble. They want to get ahead, to stand out. Such ambition has no use for a kung fu man who rejects all forms of self-assertiveness and competition. A kung fu man, if he is really good, is not proud at all. Pride emphasizes the importance of the superiority of one's status in the eyes of others. There is fear and insecurity in pride, because when one aims at being highly esteemed and having achieved such status, he is automatically involved in the fear of losing his status. Then protection of one's status appears to be his most important need, and this creates anxiety," and so forth. And this second page talks about a letter that he wrote, saying it was hard to understand because it contained his dreams and his ways of thinking. As a whole, you could call it his way of life. It would be rather confusing, as it was difficult to write down exactly how he felt. Yet he wanted to write and let all know about it. He'd do his best to write it clearly in hopes that you, i.e. the reader, etc., would keep an open mind in regard to this letter and won't arrive at any conclusions until he finished it. There are two ways of making a good living. One is the result of hard working, that is very true, and the other the result of the imagination. It requires work too, of course. It is a fact that labour and thrift produce a competence, but fortune, in the sense of wealth, is the reward of the man who can think of something that hasn't been thought of before. In every industry, in every profession, ideas are what America is looking for. Ideas have made America what she is, and one good idea will make a man what he wants to be. One part of Bruce's life was kung fu. This art influenced greatly in the formation of his character and ideas. He practiced kung fu as a physical culture, a form of mental training, a method of self-defense, and a way of life. Kung fu is the best of all martial art, yet the Chinese derivatives of judo and karate, which are only basics of kung fu, are flourishing all over the US at that time. And that so happened to be because no one had heard of the supreme art. Also, there are no competent instructors. Basically, he's saying, in a nice, polite way, they're all useless. They're pretty useless. He believes his long years of practice backed up his title to become the first instructor of this movement. There were yet long years ahead of him to polish his techniques and character. His aim, overall, therefore, was to establish a first Kung Fu institute that would later spread out all over the US. He has set a time limit of 10 to 15 years to complete the whole project. His reason in doing this was not the sole objective of making money. The motives were many, and among them were he liked to let the world know about the greatness of his Chinese art. He enjoyed teaching and helping people. He liked to have a well-to-do home for his family. He liked to originate something, or be the start of something. He created something unique. And the last, but yet one of the most important, is because Kung Fu is part of himself. He knew his idea was right, and therefore the results would be satisfactory. He didn't really worry about the reward, but to set in motion the machinery to achieve it. His contribution would be the measure of his reward and success. Bruce related to an old Hindu legend where the Supreme Being decided to implant the Godhead inside man himself because man would never think to look for it within himself. He then goes on, whether it is the Godhead or not, he felt this great force, this untapping power, this dynamic something within him, this feeling that defied description. This feeling defies description, and no experience with which this feeling may be compared. It is something like a strong emotion mixed with faith, but a lot stronger. All in all, the goal of his planning and doing was to find the true meaning and life peace of mind. He knew that the sum of the possessions he mentioned does not necessarily add up to peace of mind. However, it could be if he devoted to real accomplishment of self rather than neurotic combat. In order to achieve this peace of mind, the teaching of detachment of Taoism and Zen proved to be valuable. Probably people will say that he was too conscious of success. Well, he wasn't. You see, his will to do sprang from the knowledge that he can do. It was only being natural, for there is no fear or doubt inside his mind. Pearl, success comes to those who become success conscious. If you don't aim at an object, how the heck on earth do you think you can get it? So maybe he was writing a letter to the Japanese girl Pearl that he had the hots for, the one when she had a broken leg or something, carried her up the stairs, but he was too clingy. Maybe he's talking about that girl. Because he mentions the name Pearl. So maybe it was a letter to her at that time. Bruce Lee, ready for action. States here, turn this book sideways, hold the binding in your left hand, flip the pages with your right thumb, and watch Bruce Lee fight against one of those kind of books where all this action happens, right? There you go. Probably from Enter the Dragon. It's a fight scene, massive fight scene. You keep flicking it. We like to flick it fast, but we can't click that fast. Okay. And it goes on about the Green Hornet, and so forth.